Lance sat on his terrace long after the sun went down. The ocean moved. The stars accumulated. The island breathed its warm tropical breath around him and offered nothing useful. He was thinking about Dorian's confidence. That was the thing that kept returning. Not the machine, not the threat, not even the memory serum sitting somewhere inside Dorian's bloodstream like a ticking clock. The confidence. The absolute, unperformed certainty of a man who had told Lance to take all the time he needed and meant it. Who had walked out of that room without a backward glance, without a threat, without anything that resembled pressure, because he didn't need any of those things. He was certain Lance would comply. Why? Lance turned it over the way he turned over a problem at the whiteboard, looking for the load-bearing assumption, the piece that everything else rested on. Dorian knew who Lance was, had studied him the way he'd studied the machine, thoroughly, specifically, with the precision of a man who didn't move until he understood what he was dealing with. He knew Lance's work. He knew his ethics. He knew, presumably, that Lance was not a man who could be easily frightened into doing something he believed was wrong. And yet, he was confident. Lance's mind moved through the possibilities the way it moved through equations, methodically, discarding what didn't hold. Dorian could threaten Lance's career. Meaningless. Lance would surrender his tenure before he'd surrender this. He could threaten Lance's freedom, his safety. Lance had already accepted, sitting on this terrace, that he might not leave this island easily. He had made his peace with that as a variable. And then the thought arrived, quietly, almost gently, the way the worst thoughts always did. Juliet. Lance sat very still. Dorian knew about Juliet, had asked about her at dinner, had mentioned her during the pitch, had offered her a visit to the island with the ease of someone who had already incorporated her into his calculations. A man of Dorian's resources could reach Juliet in Palo Alto without leaving this island, could reach anyone, anywhere, without leaving this island. That was precisely what resources at that scale meant. All Dorian had to do was pick up a phone, and Juliet became a bargaining chip. And if that happened, if someone arrived at the Stanford hospital or at their apartment, and Juliet's safety became the variable, Lance knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had just looked directly at an uncomfortable truth, that he would complete the machine. He would complete it, and he would hate every moment, and he would hate himself for a very long time afterward. But he would do it. Because the alternative was Juliet, and there was no version of his ethics that survived Juliet being harmed on his behalf. He sat with that understanding for a long time, feeling, for the first time since he'd walked into the building with the machine, genuinely afraid. To control him, he realized, was not actually that difficult at all. He expected pressure, daily visits, escalating demands. Some version of Dorian's organization applied systematically, the way you applied force to a problem that wasn't moving. More of it, more consistently, until something gave. What he got was silence. Breakfast arrived each morning at 7:30, left outside his door by someone he never saw. A tray with coffee and fruit, and something freshly baked that filled the hallway with a smell he refused to enjoy. Lunch at noon, dinner at 7, 3 courses, the kind of meal that cost more per plate than most of the people Lance knew spent on groceries in a week. All of it excellent. All of it completely untouched by anything resembling pleasure, because Lance ate with the focused joylessness of a man consuming fuel and nothing else, staring at the ocean through the glass and thinking. Dorian did not come. Nobody came. The first 2 days Lance spent cataloging his situation with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist approaching a new problem. He walked the perimeter of the island twice, noting the security positions, cameras, motion sensors, 2 patrol boats visible from the eastern bluff, a rotation of guards at the dock who moved with the practiced ease of people who had done this for years. The island was not a prison in the architectural sense. It was a prison in the mathematical sense, an equation with no solution that didn't require something Lance couldn't provide. By the 3rd day, the silence had begun to do its work on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being watched, of being given enough rope to see what you'd do with it. Dorian understood, had perhaps always understood, that certainty about the outcome was more psychologically effective than pressure. Pressure implied doubt, The absence of pressure said, "I already know how this ends." By the 5th day, Lance had stopped sleeping properly. He lay in the extraordinary bed in the extraordinary villa and looked at the ceiling and thought about Juliet and thought about Kael and thought about the machine sitting in its climate-controlled room and thought about the algorithm that only he could write and thought and thought and thought until the thinking became indistinguishable from noise. The 6th morning, he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee, watching the ocean through the glass do what the ocean always did, moving, patient, entirely uninvested in his situation, when the door opened. No knock, no announcement. Dorian simply walked in, the way a man walks into a room that belongs to him, because it did. He was dressed casually, linen, open collar, the uniform of this island. And he looked at Lance sitting at the table with his cold coffee and the expression of a man who has spent a week staring into a private darkness. And something in Dorian's face moved that might have been recognition, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been both. Dorian pulled out the chair across the table and sat.
Good morning.
Lance looked at him. He had spent 6 days preparing for this conversation, rehearsing his composure, deciding what he would show and what he would conceal. He arranged his face into something that communicated ease.
Good morning. The coffee's cold. I can make more if you'd like.
I've had mine, thank you. How have you been?
Well rested. The bed is exceptional.
Dorian smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been in more negotiating rooms than Lance had been in classrooms, and who had learned to recognize the difference between a person who was comfortable and a person who was performing comfort.
You don't have to do that. I know you haven't been sleeping. I know you've been walking the perimeter. Twice, I believe. I know you've been eating mechanically and staring at the ocean and working through the same questions on a loop. I know because I would be doing exactly the same thing in your position.
Lance said nothing.
You're trying to understand why I'm confident. That's the question, isn't it? Not whether you should help me. You've already decided that. You're trying to understand what I know that you don't. Why I walked out of that room without pressure. You've been running through the possibilities. My resources, your career, your freedom. Juliet.
The word landed with surgical precision. Lance felt the cold begin at the back of his neck and held very still and said nothing, and let nothing show on his face, and was aware that none of this was fooling Dorian for a single moment.
I see that I'm right. You've been lying here in the dark thinking about what I could do to her, whether that would be enough to make you comply. And you've realized that it would be. That's what's been keeping you awake.
What do you want, Dorian?
I want to tell you what I've already decided. I have no intention of touching Juliet. Not because I'm incapable of it, because I don't need to. What I'm going to tell you instead is why you will eventually help me. Not because I threaten the person you love, but because I am the only thing standing between the world and a catastrophe that would kill millions of people, including everyone you have ever cared about.
Lance felt his breathing slow and controlled it deliberately, the way you controlled variables in an experiment.
You told me that you could start wars, that you had done it.
I did tell you that, and I meant it literally, not rhetorically. Let me give you some examples.
What followed was 15 minutes that Lance would return to many times in the months ahead, not because he enjoyed it, but because the architecture of what Dorian described demanded to be understood. He spoke about a conflict in North Africa, a resource dispute that had seemed, from the outside, to be the inevitable product of regional tensions, tribal history, colonial legacy. From the inside, Dorian explained with the calm precision of an accountant reviewing a ledger, it had been a managed event. Two governments with balance sheet problems and an appetite for their neighbors' mineral reserves. Dorian had provided the intelligence that inflamed the first incident, had connected the right arms dealers to the right procurement channels. 12,000 people dead, 300 billion in resource extraction over the following decade, of which a precise percentage had flowed through a chain of holding companies to accounts that Dorian described with the same dispassion he'd applied to everything else. He spoke about a currency crisis in Southeast Asia that had bankrupted a generation of middle-class families. The crisis had not been spontaneous. It had been designed. A coordinated short position against three currencies simultaneously. executed through proxies. Governments fell. Others scrambled to fill the vacuum. Dorian's funds had been positioned on the correct side of every development. He spoke about a shipping lane conflict that had lasted 7 years, killing 30,000 sailors and merchant workers, disrupting global supply chains in ways that had raised prices for ordinary people on 6 continents. He described it without drama, without apology, simply as a series of events he had set in motion and monitored and concluded when the profit objectives had been met. Lance sat across from him and listened, and felt something cold and permanent settle in his understanding of what a human being was capable of.
And if you die, what happens?
I have left instructions, with people who have spent decades following my instructions and who have no reason to stop doing so after I'm gone. Those instructions describe a sequence of events, specific, targeted, irreversible, that will set in motion the largest conflict the world has seen since 1945. Not conventional, nuclear. The nations involved are already positioned. The pretexts are already prepared. All that is required is the signal. I will not be alive to see the consequences, which means I have no reason to moderate them. The signal, once sent, cannot be recalled.
The kitchen was very quiet. Through the glass, the ocean continued its patient indifference.
Half the world.
Conservatively. Your work, your area of expertise. You understand better than most what planetary-scale disruption actually means. You also understand that there is one mechanism by which the signal, once sent, could be recalled, by which every consequence of that signal could be undone before it reached anyone.
The time machine. Lance looked at the table, at his cold, untouched coffee. Reverse time. Go back to before Dorian died, before the signal was sent, and all of it, the war, the dead, the nuclear exchange, simply doesn't happen. The trap was so elegant, he almost admired it. His own moral framework, the one he'd built his refusal on, the one that said you couldn't reverse time for one man's benefit at the expense of the entire world, had been inverted completely. Now, not reversing time was the choice with global consequences. Reversing it was the choice that saved lives. Dorian had taken Lance's ethics and turned them into the instrument of his compliance.
You see it. Good. I would prefer you to cooperate because you understand the situation fully, not because you've been coerced. Take whatever time you need. The machine is waiting.
He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. The same gesture as before, the same slight turn back.
I would suggest, for your own peace of mind, that you stop trying to find a way out of this and start thinking about how to make the best of it. In my experience, that shift in perspective changes everything.
He walked out. The door closed. Lance sat at the table for a long time. Stall. That's all. Stall. He couldn't help Dorian. He would not build him a functioning time machine and hand it over and stand back while this man used it as an instrument of personal immortality. But he also could not call Dorian's bluff on the nuclear threat, not without knowing for certain it was a bluff. And after everything Dorian had just recounted with the flat precision of a man reading from a financial report, Lance was not certain of that at all. So, stall. Buy time. Think. And while he was stalling, he would learn. He would go to the machine, not to complete it, but to understand it. To understand what Dorian's people had built and how they'd built it, and what they knew and what they didn't know. Because somewhere in the gap between what they had and what he alone could provide, there might be room to maneuver. He pushed back from the table, left the coffee where it was, and walked toward the machine building for the first time since the day Dorian had shown it to him. Lance spent the first day simply walking through the machine, not as a student, but as its creator, returning to something that had been taken apart and rebuilt in his absence. He wasn't learning it, he was inspecting it, checking what Dorian's team had gotten right, what they had missed, and most importantly, what they thought they understood, but didn't. The physical construction was impressive. Whoever had been commissioned to build this had worked from the schematics with real precision, and the results showed it. Every component was where it should be, every connection made. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, it would have appeared complete. Lance pulled up the computer system attached to the machine. The interface was familiar. They had replicated that too, down to the display architecture. He moved through the menus with the ease of someone navigating their own home, going deeper, past the surface systems, past the monitoring protocols, into the core where the machine's operational logic lived. He found the gap immediately. Of course he did. It was exactly where he knew it would be. The algorithm, the calibration sequence, the precise mathematical logic that told every other component what to do and in what order. The schematics had given Dorian's team everything except this, because this had never been written down. It had never existed anywhere except in Lance's head. He sat back from the screen. A slight smile crossed his face, not of amusement, not of pleasure, but of the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed something important. This machine, with all its extraordinary physical precision, all of Dorian's extraordinary resources behind it, was without that algorithm exactly what Lance had suspected it was. A very expensive, very elaborate, entirely purposeless object. A giant machine that might as well have been a giant rock. Dorian had everything. Everything except the one thing that mattered. The lab felt different now. The warmth of those first 3 weeks, the whiteboard equations, the coffee at 7, Mara's folded down page corners, had not disappeared exactly, but had acquired the specific discomfort of a room where something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Osei greeted him with a directness that acknowledged the distance without pretending it wasn't there. Mara looked up from her bench, held his gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than casual, then looked back at her work. Lance sat. He asked about the surgery timeline. Osei told him, 1 to 2 weeks, depending on final preparation. The team was ready. The protocols were established.
And Kael?
Osei's expression didn't change.
He arrives later today.
Lance nodded. He stayed another hour, listening, learning the schedule and the structure, and the details that a person needed to know if they were going to plan something without anyone noticing they were planning it. Then he left. Mara caught up with him in the corridor outside. Her voice was quiet. She glanced back at the lab door, then at him, choosing words with unusual care. More care than Mara Thorne, who was not a person who normally struggled with words, typically required.
How are you?
Not how are you doing, just how are you? The weight of it, slightly different.
Managing.
She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression was doing the same complicated thing it had been doing the day everything changed. The surface holding firm, the layer underneath in motion.
Good. Keep managing.
She went back inside. Lance stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he walked back toward the machine building and his notes and the problem he had not yet solved. Kael arrived that afternoon. Lance was on the path between the research complex and his villa when he heard it. The distant approach of a small aircraft growing louder, and then the Cessna appearing low over the tree line and touching down on the island's narrow airstrip. Lance stopped and watched from the top of the eastern bluff as the plane taxied and the door opened. The young man who stepped out was not what Lance had expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected. 24 years old, Osei had said, in excellent physical condition. What Lance saw stopped him. He was perhaps the same height as Dorian, with the same broad, straight shoulders, the same strong line of the jaw, the same mixed heritage written into his features. If you had shown Lance a photograph of Dorian at 24, he suspected it would have looked something like this. The same man, 50 years apart. One arriving at the end of something, one being brought here as the vessel for its continuation. But where Dorian's body carried the quiet accumulation of age, the stiffness, the careful movement, the body compensating for what it had lost, Kael moved with the unconscious physical ease of someone whose body had never once failed him. Young and strong and entirely unaware, Lance suspected, of what that ease was about to cost him. Someone Lance didn't recognize met him at the airstrip and walked beside him along the southern path, speaking in low tones. Kael nodded once, twice, didn't look around, kept his eyes forward with the focus of someone who had decided that looking around would make it worse. They went to a section of the island Lance hadn't been to. The path turned, and they were gone. 24 years old, only a handful of years younger than Lance himself, which made it worse somehow. Not a generation removed, not a distant abstraction, but someone who had been navigating the same world Lance had been navigating, just with far fewer options available to him. And he thought about Kael's face as he had walked off that plane. It wasn't the face of someone who didn't understand what he had agreed to. That was what struck Lance most. There was no naivety in it, no performance of bravery, no attempt to look unbothered. Kael knew exactly what was coming. The knowledge was written into every line of him. There was sadness there, real and unguarded. The sadness of a young man mourning something he had chosen to give up and hadn't yet fully accepted losing. But underneath it, there was something else. A quiet, determined pride. The expression of someone who has decided that what they are sacrificing means something, that the people who will benefit from it make it worth carrying. He was walking toward the worst thing that would ever happen to him, and he was walking toward it on his own terms, for his own reasons, and he knew it. Lance stood on the bluff for a long time after the path turned and Kael was gone. He thought, Dorian found the one kind of person you cannot argue with. Not someone desperate enough to do anything, someone who loves their family enough to do this specific thing. And that distinction, that was what made it unforgivable. The days that followed moved quickly. Lance visited the machine daily. He worked through it with methodical patience, documenting everything, understanding everything, testing the components that were testable, without completing the circuit that would make the machine real. He wrote equations in his notebook that looked, to anyone who might glance at them, like progress toward completion. They were, but they were also, layered beneath the surface work, something else. A different problem entirely. A problem nobody had asked him to solve. He visited the lab every few days. He and Ose worked in the careful, slightly formal register of two people who had decided that the work was more important than what lay between them, which was true and also useful. Mara he saw less. She was occupied with the pre-operative protocols, the cellular preparation, the immunosuppressive regimen that she and her team had designed to give Kael and Dorian the best possible chance of surviving what was about to happen to both of them. She did not seek him out again in corridors, but once, passing his villa in the early morning on her way to the lab, she paused at the terrace railing and looked at him, sitting with his coffee and his notebook.
Still managing?
Still managing.
She nodded and walked on. He watched her go and thought about what keep managing had meant, and whether it meant the same thing she'd meant it, and decided he didn't know yet. He thought about it anyway.